quick, picture Washington State. If you're thinking endless rain and soggy green forest, you've got maybe half. This is a state where a mountain once collapsed in on itself in the biggest landslide ever recorded, where the largest waterfall in Earth's history now sits completely dry, and where one American town can only be reached by driving out of the country and back in through Canada. Everyone knows the rain. Almost nobody knows the rest. So let's get into it. 50 facts that will completely change how you see the Evergreen State. On the morning of May 18th, 1980, the entire north face of Mount St. Helens came loose and slid. This remains the largest landslide ever recorded. About 2/3 of a cubic mile of rock and ice broke away and raced 14 miles down the valley. The mountain lost more than 1,300 feet of its own summit in minutes, and it left behind a debris field covering 24 square miles, buried in places under 600 feet of shattered rock. St. Helens didn't blow its top first, it walked out from under itself. Out in central Washington, there's a cliff 3.5 miles wide and 400 feet tall. Long ago, it was the most powerful waterfall the planet has ever seen, 3 times the height of Niagara. Today, not a drop flows over it. This is Dry Falls. During the Ice Age, a massive flood carved this canyon open. Then the flood stopped, the river changed course, and the greatest waterfall in history simply shut off, like someone switched off a tap. In the far northwest corner of the state sits Point Roberts, a small American community you can't drive to without leaving the country first. It hangs off Canada, so to reach it, you cross into British Columbia, drive through Canadian suburbs, and then re-enter the U.S. at a second border crossing. For years, local kids passed through 4 border checkpoints a day just to get to high school on the mainland. Mount Rainier holds the largest glacier system of any mountain in the lower 48 states, about 24 named glaciers. One of them, the Carbon Glacier, holds more ice than any glacier in the country outside Alaska, and it reaches down to one of the lowest elevations any glacier in the lower 48 manages to survive at. Washington somehow contains both a rainforest and a desert. The Olympic Peninsula gets 12 to 14 feet of rain a year, making it one of the wettest places in the country. But just a few hours east, towns like Sequim get barely 16 inches a year, and the land turns into true desert with cactus and sagebrush. Same state, same afternoons drive apart, Washington couldn't pick one climate, so it kept both. Lake Chelan is the 3rd deepest lake in the country, dropping 1,486 feet straight down. Its floor sits nearly 400 feet below sea level. If you measure from the mountain peaks above it down to the lake bed, the trough is actually deeper than the Grand Canyon. You could be standing on a beach with a coffee in hand, and directly beneath you sits a canyon deeper than Arizona's most famous hole in the ground. Much of eastern Washington sits on top of one of the largest piles of lava on the planet. Between 17 and 6 million years ago, floods of molten rock spread for hundreds of miles, stacking up nearly 2 miles thick in places, burying an area the size of a small country. Those flat, stair-stepped cliffs along the Columbia River are just layer after layer of frozen eruptions. During the winter of 1998 to 1999, Mount Baker recorded 1,140 inches of snow, that's 95 feet. It's still the most snow ever measured at one location on Earth in a single season, a wall of snow taller than a 9-story building, all dumped on one ski hill in a single winter. South of Olympia, there's a prairie covered in thousands of strange, evenly spaced earthen mounds. Some blame generations of busy pocket gophers, others blame old earthquakes or melting glaciers. Scientists have studied them for over 100 years and still can't agree on how they formed. Parts of eastern Washington look so much like Mars that NASA scientists have used them to study the Martian surface. These channeled scapulins were carved by catastrophic ancient floods, the same kind of event that shaped much of this list, and the man who first figured that out closes out this whole countdown near the very end. Grand Coulee Dam is the largest concrete structure ever built in the United States. It used around 12 million cubic yards of concrete, enough to build a 4-foot wide sidewalk that wraps around the Earth's equator twice. It's also the country's single biggest producer of hydroelectric power, poured around the clock by crews during the Great Depression. In February 1910, near a railroad stop called Wellington, a massive avalanche swept 2 stranded trains off the tracks, killing 96 people. It remains the deadliest avalanche in American history. The railroad was so shaken by what happened that it eventually renamed the town entirely, trying to erase Wellington from the map. About 500 years ago, a huge landslide near the Columbia Gorge completely dammed the Columbia River, creating a natural bridge Native peoples called the Bridge of the Gods. The river eventually broke through, leaving behind rapids and a legend, and a modern steel bridge at that spot is still named after it today. The rolling green hills of the Palouse region look sculpted, and in a way, they are, by wind. After the Ice Age floods, wind piled fine silt into dunes over thousands of years, some over 200 feet deep. Most people can name Mount Rainier or Mount St. Helens, but almost nobody mentions Glacier Peak, one of the most explosive volcanoes in the whole Cascade Range, hidden so far back in the wilderness that most residents have never even seen it. In the town of Worthing, Washington, school kids practice evacuation drills for a volcanic mudflow called a lahar. The town sits directly in the path one could take from Mount Rainier, and geologists say it could arrive in under an hour. The actual westernmost point in the lower 48 states isn't in California or Oregon, it's a remote headland on the Olympic Peninsula called Cape Alava. The Cascade Mountain Range runs the entire length of the state, and only one river has ever cut straight through it at sea level, the Columbia. Every highway and railroad in the region squeezes through that single gap. The Olympic Peninsula holds the longest undeveloped, roadless stretch of coastline in the lower 48 states, more than 70 miles with no roads or towns at all. Washington has 5 active volcanoes: Mount Baker, Glacier Peak, Mount Rainier, Mount Adams, and Mount St. Helens, all monitored, all capable of erupting again. Hidden on the side of Mount St. Helens is Ape Cave, the longest lava tube in the continental United States, running more than 2.5 miles underground in complete darkness. Mount Adams, Washington's second highest peak at over 12,000 feet, is one of the biggest volcanoes by sheer size in the entire Cascade Range, yet it's so far from major cities that most people barely notice it. Snoqualmie Falls plunges 268 feet, about 100 feet taller than Niagara Falls, and sits less than an hour from Seattle. There's even a working hydroelectric plant built into the rock behind it. Diablo Lake in the North Cascades glows an unreal turquoise blue. The color comes from extremely fine glacial powder called rock flour, suspended in the meltwater, scattering sunlight. Palouse Falls, the official state waterfall, drops nearly 200 feet into a stone amphitheater carved out almost instantly by the same Ice Age megafloods that shaped so much of this state. On the evening of January 26, 1700, a massive earthquake struck off the Washington coast, launching a tsunami that hit Japan about 10 hours later. Japanese records of that wave are actually how scientists confirmed the quake happened, since nobody on this side of the ocean wrote it down. The Olympic Mountains are made of rock that started at the bottom of the ocean. As the seafloor slowly slides beneath the continent, it scrapes up ancient seabed and pushes it skyward, which is how marine rock ended up thousands of feet above sea level. Washington is the only U.S. state named after a president, George Washington, even though he never set foot anywhere near it. The Long Beach Peninsula has a strip of sand so long and flat that it's an official public highway, where you can legally drive your car right along the surf for 28 miles. Tucked into the northwest corner of the state, the San Juan Islands include 172 named islands, with even more rocks and reefs appearing at low tide. Washington's official state gem isn't a jewel, it's petrified wood. Ancient lava floods buried entire forests, and over millions of years, the wood slowly turned to stone. Beacon Rock, along the Columbia River Gorge, rises 848 feet as a single freestanding pillar. It's actually the hardened core of an ancient volcano that eroded away around it. At the mouth of the Columbia River sits Cape Disappointment, one of the foggiest places in the United States, socked in with fog for roughly 100 days a year. The Cascade Mountains split Washington into 2 completely different climates, the wet, green west side everyone imagines, and a dry, sunny, sagebrush-covered east side that can go weeks without rain. In downtown Spokane, a genuine mooring waterfall crashes right through the middle of the city, close enough that you can ride a gondola directly over it on your lunch break. Washington's outer coastline looks short on a map, only about 150 miles. But once you count every inlet, island, and twisting arm of Puget Sound, the total shoreline balloons to roughly 3,000 miles. Near Whidbey Island, a narrow channel called Deception Pass forces huge amounts of tide through a tight gap twice a day, creating currents so strong that boats have to wait for the calmer slack tide just to pass safely. Puget Sound is the second largest estuary in the country, behind only Chesapeake Bay. Glaciers carved it into deep underwater canyons, plunging more than 900 feet in places. At Wallula Gap, ancient Ice Age megafloods once got bottlenecked, backing up water hundreds of feet deep and creating a temporary inland sea that drowned entire valleys for days. Mount Rainier is considered the most dangerous volcano in the United States, not mainly because of lava, but because of its massive glaciers. If the volcano stirs, melting ice could trigger a fast-moving mudflow capable of burying entire towns. Nearly the whole Columbia River has been dammed, except for one final stretch called the Hanford Reach. It survived only because it flowed past the top-secret Hanford nuclear site, where security kept dam builders away for decades. The rainiest town in the state isn't CO, it's the small town of Forks on the Olympic Peninsula, which gets around 120 inches of rain a year, roughly 4 times what falls on CO. In the Palouse region, a single steep hill of ancient granite sticks up out of the wheat fields. It's called Steptoe Butte, and it was so distinctive that geologists now use Steptoe as the official term for any hill like it anywhere on Earth. Washington grows more apples than any other state by far, about 6 out of every 10 apples eaten in America. Ironically, most of that fruit grows in what is naturally a desert, kept alive only by irrigation from the Columbia River. Mount Rainier's glaciers act like a giant frozen reservoir, feeding 5 major rivers at once, enough water to supply drinking water, salmon runs, and farmland across a huge stretch of the state. Lake Crescent on the Olympic Peninsula is famous for one eerie detail. In 1940, a corpse pulled from its cold, low-oxygen water hadn't decayed normally. Instead, the body's fat had turned into a waxy, soap-like substance that preserved it for years, in a case known as the Lady of the Lake. Washington holds roughly half of all the glaciers found in the contiguous United States, with North Cascades National Park alone containing over 300 of them, more than Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado combined. The mountains of Washington are still rising today. The same slow collision that pushed the Olympic Mountains up out of the ocean floor continues right now, lifting the coastline a tiny bit more every year. And here's one that sounds impossible. The Columbia River used to flow through a completely different canyon. During the Ice Age, a wall of ice blocked its normal path, forcing it to carve a brand new channel, the Grand Coulee. When the ice melted, the river went back to its old route, leaving that giant canyon behind, mostly dry, to this day. Finally, almost every strange feature on this list, the dry waterfall, the Mars-like landscape, the stranded falls, traces back to one idea a geologist named J. Harlan Bretz proposed in the 1920s. He argued that a catastrophic flood, bigger than anyone could imagine, had carved eastern Washington in a matter of days. Scientists mocked him for decades. Then, piece by piece, the evidence proved him completely right. In 1979, at 96 years old, he finally received geology's highest honor, decades after everyone had written him off. And that's Washington State. A dry waterfall, a landslide bigger than anything ever recorded, glaciers that outnumber the rest of the country combined, and a scientist who was right all along. Thanks for watching. Stick around, because 50 crazy geography facts about Florida are coming up next.